The streets of Rome in 1886 were a place of contradictions, a city where the grandeur of ancient ruins and the solemnity of cathedrals clashed with the shadows of poverty, superstition, and the unknown. Gas lamps flickered along cobblestone avenues, casting elongated, trembling silhouettes that seemed to stretch and warp the very air. The hum of the city, merchants calling out their wares, the distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the soft murmurs of travellers, was punctuated by the occasional toll of a cathedral bell. It was a city alive with history, yet steeped in whispers of death and decay. And in the heart of this city, behind the crumbling stone walls of a psychiatric asylum, a phenomenon occurred that would haunt the annals of medical and cultural history, a number of inmates insisting, with eerie conviction, that they were already dead. From the outset, this story is not one of ordinary madness or routine psychiatric observation. It is a tale that sits at the intersection of medicine, superstition, and human obsession with mortality. The asylum itself was imposing, an austere fortress of brick and mortar perched along the outskirts of the city, its high walls enclosing hallways that echoed with despair. Its windows, narrow and barred, allowed little light to filter in, bathing the rooms in a perpetual gloom. The air within carried a peculiar mix of antiseptic, damp stone, and the faint but unmistakable tang of human suffering. Patients, dressed in plain, uniform garments, wandered the corridors with vacant eyes or muttered incessantly, sometimes addressing themselves, sometimes responding to voices that no one else could hear. Amid this gloom, a subset of individuals began to speak with a chilling insistence, claiming not merely illness, but the impossible, that they were no longer alive. To the casual observer, their statements might have seemed delusional, perhaps even theatrically exaggerated. Yet those who documented these occurrences, the physicians, nurses, and visitors, were struck by the precision and consistency with which the inmates described their supposed death. They would claim they could no longer feel warmth, or that their reflection in a mirror was no longer their own. Some went so far as to refuse food, insisting that their bodies were mere vessels, empty shells through which life no longer flowed. Others would speak of walking through a world that existed only for the living, expressing sorrow that they could not interact with it as they once had. There was a certainty in their voices, a conviction that unsettled even the most experienced staff. It was as though they were observers of their own lives rather than participants, and this detached awareness made their claims more disturbing than the usual episodes of hysteria or psychosis. The phenomenon cannot be fully understood without first appreciating the broader cultural context of Rome at this time. Death was not merely a medical event or a personal loss, it was a constant companion in everyday life. Families often lived in close quarters with multiple generations under one roof, and mortality rates were high, particularly among children. Religion infused every aspect of life, with the Catholic Church holding immense sway over public perception of death, the soul, and the afterlife. People believed in purgatory, in spirits lingering between worlds, and in the possibility that the dead could influence the living. Against this backdrop, the claims of the so-called dead inmates did not merely frighten the staff, they resonated with a deeper, almost mythic understanding of mortality that many Romans already held. The boundary between life and death, though scientifically demarcated, felt fragile, porous, and malleable. Yet what made the asylum cases so compelling was the intersection of this cultural fear with medical uncertainty. Psychiatry in 1886 was still in its infancy. Treatments were rudimentary, and diagnoses were often as much art as science. Doctors relied heavily on observation, intuition, and the anecdotal reports of nurses and family members. The line between a genuine delusion, a symptom of mental illness, and a phenomenon that defied easy categorization was perilously thin. In this environment, claims of being dead could not be dismissed lightly, even if they seemed fantastical. They demanded attention, documentation, and reflection. Each statement, each gesture of refusal or detachment, was recorded meticulously, yet with a tone of cautious disbelief. Physicians and staff were compelled to reconcile the horror of what the inmates described with the limitations of their understanding. The stories of these inmates were varied but shared a haunting similarity. One patient, a middle-aged man of quiet disposition, would wander the corridors silently for hours, pausing to look into reflective surfaces and muttering that his reflection belonged to someone else, a life that had once been his but no longer. Another, a young woman who had suffered from repeated bouts of fever and depression, claimed that she had died the previous year and that everything around her was a world she could no longer truly touch. Staff attempted to engage her with conversation, urging her to eat and participate in daily routines, but she resisted, her eyes distant and unfocused. The conviction in her tone, the logic in her reasoning, at least from her perspective, was unnerving. Visitors who came to see their relatives described an almost spectral presence, as if the inmates existed on a plane adjacent to reality, observing life from behind an invisible veil. There was a distinct theatricality to their behaviors, yet it was devoid of malice or performative intent. These were not manipulative actions meant to deceive. They were lived experiences, fully internalized, and expressed with an intensity that blurred the line between reality and delusion. Some observers noted that these inmates displayed a heightened sense of awareness of death in general. They could describe funerary customs with uncanny detail, recount symptoms of terminal illnesses, and speak of the moment life leaves the body with a chilling certainty. It was as if they had bypassed ordinary mortality, existing in a liminal state that challenged the understanding of everyone around them. For the contemporary audience, this would have been terrifying, yet also fascinating. The fear of death is universal, but the notion that someone could inhabit their own death while still breathing strikes a uniquely unsettling chord. It forces a confrontation with mortality not as a distant inevitability but as an immediate, lived experience. The inmates' insistence on their own death became a mirror, reflecting societal anxieties about the fragility of life, the limits of medicine, and the thin boundary between sanity and madness. It was a spectacle of human psychology, tragedy, and the uncanny, set against the rich, shadowed tapestry of Rome at the end of the 19th century. In this way, the story begins not in the halls of the asylum but in the imagination of the viewer. One is compelled to ask, what does it mean to be alive? To be conscious, to think, to perceive, yet to be certain, against all evidence, that one no longer exists? These inmates forced everyone around them, doctors, nurses, visitors, and historians, to grapple with questions that have haunted humanity for centuries. It was not merely a medical curiosity, it was an existential puzzle, a confrontation with the unknowable, dressed in the drab uniforms and dim corridors of a forgotten Roman asylum. And so, the stage was set. In the fog-shrouded streets of Rome, beneath the grandeur of ancient stone and the ever-present shadows of mortality, the inmates who claimed they were dead walked unseen among the living. Their voices, sometimes whispered, sometimes insistent, began to etch a record into history that would fascinate and horrify for generations to come. What followed was not a simple story of illness, but a journey into the darkest corners of human consciousness, an exploration of life at the edge of death, and a chilling testament to the mysteries that lie within the human mind. The city itself seemed to lean in, listening, as if Rome remembered its dead not in tombs alone, but in the fleeting, spectral presences of those who claimed to have transcended life entirely. Rome in 1886 was a city suspended between the weight of its past and the stirrings of modernity, a place where the grandeur of antiquity pressed against the emerging realities of a new Italy. The cobbled streets, lined with crumbling facades and shadowed piazzas, bore witness to centuries of triumph and turmoil. Ancient temples and monuments stood like silent sentinels, reminders of empires that had risen and fallen, while the ordinary citizens moved through a world still steeped in superstition, religious ritual, and deeply ingrained social hierarchies. Life and death were inseparable companions in the city's consciousness, and the people's understanding of mortality was filtered through centuries of cultural and religious influence. At the time, Italy had been unified only a few decades prior, and Rome had recently assumed its role as the capital. This transition brought political tension, bureaucratic restructuring, and a clash of traditions. The Catholic Church retained enormous influence, dictating not only spiritual life but public morality and social behavior. Death was considered sacred and terrifying in equal measure. It was a threshold whose crossing was governed by divine authority. Burial practices, the rituals of mourning, and the pervasive belief in an afterlife permeated daily life. For most Romans, death was an omnipresent reality, with cemeteries located near churches and homes frequently crowded with multiple generations. Childhood mortality rates were high, infectious disease was common, and grief was an almost constant companion. Against this backdrop, the idea of someone asserting that they were already dead struck a chord that was both horrifying and curiously familiar. Scientific understanding of the human body and mind was expanding but remained rudimentary in comparison to modern standards. Physicians and early psychiatrists were beginning to explore mental illness as a biological and psychological phenomenon, but superstition and folklore still heavily influenced diagnoses. Terms like hysteria, melancholia, and mania were widely used, often without rigorous clinical definition, and treatment was frequently experimental, sometimes cruel, and almost always steeped in misunderstanding. The mind, particularly when it wandered into realms of delusion or obsession, was both feared and mysterious. People believed in spirits, omens, and the idea that the soul might exist independently of the body. These beliefs were reinforced by literature, religious teachings, and the pervasive imagery of death in art and theatre. Within this cultural and medical milieu, the asylum where the dead inmates were confined became a microcosm of Roman anxieties. It was not merely a place for treatment, but a site where the boundaries of life, death, and consciousness were tested in the most unsettling ways. The city itself seemed to provide fertile ground for the phenomenon. Rome's dense urban quarters, narrow alleys, and fog-laden evenings created a landscape that encouraged reflection on mortality. In such an environment, fear and fascination often mingled. Stories of ghosts, restless spirits, and cursed individuals circulated freely, blurring the line between reality and legend. For residents and visitors alike, the city streets carried the echo of those who had passed before, and the idea that someone could claim to be dead while walking among the living resonated with both dread and morbid curiosity. The social dynamics of Rome further complicated the picture. Families were tightly knit, yet social hierarchies were rigid. Poverty was rampant among the lower classes, and illness, both physical and mental, was stigmatized. Those who deviated from societal norms were often hidden away, either within families or in institutions. Mental illness was not understood as a medical condition requiring compassion or structured intervention, but was often treated as a moral failing, a spiritual weakness, or a dangerous deviation. Within this context, the asylum's inmates were both feared and pitied. Their insistence that they were dead challenged not only the doctor's understanding of human consciousness, but also the broader societal notions of morality, existence, and the soul. It is also important to understand the philosophical atmosphere of the time. The late 19th century was a period of intellectual exploration in Europe, with psychology beginning to emerge as a field of study and philosophy grappling with questions of consciousness, existence, and mortality. Thinkers were attempting to reconcile the mechanistic understanding of the human body with questions of the soul and identity. This intellectual ferment made the claims of the inmates particularly fascinating to some scholars. Here were real human beings asserting a condition that touched on existential philosophy, neurological curiosity, and spiritual speculation all at once. Their claims, though frightening, became a prism through which broader societal anxieties about life, death, and sanity could be examined. The medical establishment, meanwhile, approached these phenomena with both skepticism and intrigue. Physicians who visited the asylum were trained to observe, measure, and categorize behavior, yet they were confronted with patterns that defied conventional logic. Inmates spoke with precise conviction of experiences that could not be externally verified. They described sensations of being dead, the absence of vitality in their bodies, and the perception of living in a world that no longer included them. Doctors attempted to categorize these experiences within known psychiatric frameworks, but the intensity and consistency of the claims puzzled even the most experienced professionals. Notes from physicians of the time describe encounters with inmates who would insist on their own non-existence while maintaining coherent thought, speech, and perception, a combination that challenged the boundaries of medical understanding and invited speculation. It is within this tension between societal fear, medical uncertainty, and philosophical curiosity that the phenomenon of the walking dead inmates becomes most compelling. The Roman public, steeped in ritual, superstition, and reverence for the afterlife, could find the claims terrifying yet intellectually fascinating. Families who visited the asylum often came with a mixture of dread and hope, seeking explanations that might restore normalcy or provide insight into the enigmatic behavior of their loved ones. Visitors' accounts describe a haunting atmosphere, patients moving with deliberate slowness, muttering cryptic statements about their own deaths, or staring with an unsettling detachment at the living. In the eyes of these witnesses, the boundary between life and death was no longer fixed. It was fluid, fragile, and disturbingly negotiable. Even the city itself seemed to reflect these anxieties. Rome's monuments, tombs, and churches were not just historical artifacts but reminders that the past was never truly gone, that the dead lingered in memory, in architecture, and in ritual. The living shared space with reminders of mortality, and this constant proximity may have influenced both the inmates' experiences and the way the city perceived them. Death was a visible, almost tangible presence, and within the asylum walls, it became even more immediate, embodied by those who claimed to have crossed the threshold yet remained among the living. In many ways, understanding Rome in 1886 is essential to understanding the phenomenon itself. The cultural, religious, and philosophical attitudes toward death, combined with the nascent state of psychiatric medicine, created a perfect storm in which such extraordinary claims could emerge, be taken seriously, and leave a lasting imprint on both history and imagination. The city's shadows, both literal and metaphorical, enveloped these stories, lending them a weight that went far beyond the confines of a single institution. Here, in the twilight of history and science, the human mind was confronted with its own mortality, and the world would bear witness to some of the earliest documented instances of what would later be recognized as one of the most haunting psychiatric phenomena in recorded history. In this light, the events of the asylum cannot be separated from the city that nurtured them. Rome, with its ancient streets, sacred spaces, and looming shadows of death, was both stage and participant in this extraordinary narrative. The inmates' claims of being dead were terrifying not only because they defied medical explanation, but because they resonated with the fears, beliefs, and cultural memory of the city itself. The lines between reality, perception, and legend blurred, creating an atmosphere in which the living could be haunted by the dead, not in tombs, but walking beside them, speaking from within them, insisting on their presence even as they claimed absence. It was a city primed to understand, fear, and ultimately record the voices of those who had already crossed into the unknown. The asylum itself was a labyrinth of shadowed hallways, high-walled courtyards, and stone chambers that seemed to absorb sound, leaving only the echo of footsteps and murmured words. It was not merely a building but a world apart, a place where the ordinary rules of society were suspended, replaced by an order dictated by observation, confinement, and the fragile authority of the physicians who walked its corridors. The architecture was designed both to contain and to impress. Thick stone walls, narrow barred windows, and locked doors that separated one ward from another. Light entered sparingly, casting long, angular shadows across the floors and walls, giving the impression that the asylum itself was alive, breathing slowly in rhythm with the human despair within it. For those who worked there, and for those imprisoned by its walls, every day was a negotiation with the weight of mortality, the spectre of madness, and the omnipresent possibility of suffering. Among the asylum's population, a distinct group began to attract attention. These were the inmates who would insist, with unwavering certainty, that they were already dead. Their presence was subtle at first, easily dismissed as eccentricity or the effects of mental illness. But over time, patterns emerged. Staff began to notice the same gestures repeated in multiple wards, a patient refusing food, claiming that sustenance could no longer nourish a body that no longer lived, another staring into mirrors for hours, insisting that the reflection belonged to someone else, someone who had died while they remained trapped in the corporeal shell, yet another wandering the halls, whispering of funeral rituals, tombs, and the sensations of leaving the living world behind. These were not random outbursts but sustained behaviors, consistent enough to defy the usual explanations of madness. The staff, initially perplexed, began to document the occurrences meticulously. Physicians took notes on each patient, recording their speech patterns, body language, and interactions with both staff and other inmates. Nurses wrote in diaries about the eerie atmosphere that seemed to cling to certain individuals, noting how some would move silently through corridors, ignoring the living, yet reacting with intensity to the mere mention of death. Visitors were often unsettled, describing encounters with inmates who appeared present in body but absent in spirit. There was a spectral quality to these patients, a detachment that unsettled everyone who came into contact with them. In this environment, the ordinary rhythms of the asylum, the administration of medicines, meals, and therapies, were punctuated by moments of profound discomfort and inexplicable fear. To understand the magnitude of these claims, it is necessary to consider the backgrounds of the inmates themselves. Many had experienced trauma prior to their institutionalization, loss of family members, debilitating illness, poverty, or social ostracism. One man, for example, had spent his youth in rural Lazio, witnessing the death of siblings from disease, before moving to Rome in search of employment and stability. By the time he arrived at the asylum, he carried with him a preoccupation with mortality, a fascination with death that had transformed into a lived experience within the confines of his own mind. Another, a young woman, had endured repeated bouts of fever, emotional neglect, and social isolation, factors that compounded her sense of disconnection from the living world. These personal histories were not simply backstory. They were the fertile ground from which the delusions, or perhaps insights, of being dead sprouted. The asylum provided both the containment and the canvas for these experiences to manifest outwardly, in ways that challenged the understanding of those tasked with care. The behaviors of the dead inmates often followed a pattern, which made them even more compelling to observe. Some would refuse food or water, asserting that the physical needs of the living no longer applied to them. Others would adopt postures of stillness and detachment, sitting in corners for hours as though waiting for an invisible force to guide them beyond the threshold of existence. Many spoke in a hushed, reverent tone when discussing death, as if describing a sacred journey rather than a symptom of illness. They could recount details of embalming, funerary rites, and anatomical decay with unsettling accuracy, despite no formal training. In some cases, they even predicted their own deaths, either by specifying dates or describing the sensations of their departure from life, leaving staff to grapple with the eerie combination of insight and delusion. What made the phenomenon particularly troubling to the staff was the consistency across multiple patients. These were not isolated incidents. They represented a cluster of experiences that shared common features: the rejection of bodily life, the detachment from the world of the living, and the intense conviction of their own death. Physicians debated how to categorize these behaviors, torn between rational explanations and the disturbing possibility that something more profound was occurring. Was this a form of catatonia, a manifestation of melancholia, or an early example of what would later be recognized as Coded's delusion? Each theory brought partial answers, but none fully accounted for the combination of cognitive clarity, sustained behavior, and eerie insight into death displayed by the patients. Visitors who came to the asylum described encounters that reinforced the unnerving reality of these behaviors. Families would enter with hope, seeking understanding or recovery, and leave with a sense of disquiet that lingered long after the visit. Some reported that the patient's eyes seemed hollow, yet piercing, observing life without participating in it. Others noted the quiet rituals the inmates performed, such as tracing the outlines of coffins in the dust or whispering prayers to deceased relatives. It was as if the asylum had become a liminal space where the boundary between life and death was not only blurred but actively contested. The ordinary rhythms of social interaction, the exchange of conversation, the sharing of meals, the simple recognition of presence, were disrupted by the persistent insistence of certain individuals that they no longer belonged to the living world. The physicians themselves were caught in a difficult position. They were expected to maintain order, provide care, and uphold societal confidence in medical authority, yet they were confronted daily with behaviors that defied easy categorization. Some approached the phenomenon with scientific curiosity, documenting patterns, attempting experimental interventions, and corresponding with colleagues in other cities and countries. Others viewed the behaviors with unease, fearing that the intensity of the claims, combined with their theatricality and persistence, might destabilize the institution or provoke panic among visitors. This tension, the need to understand while simultaneously containing fear, was a constant backdrop to life within the asylum's walls. It is worth noting that not all inmates who claimed they were dead were entirely unwell in every sense. Some displayed remarkable cognitive faculties, engaging in conversation with logic and insight even as they insisted on their non-existence. Others showed artistic or literary talent, composing poems, letters, or sketches that explored the themes of mortality and absence. These expressions added a further layer of complexity, suggesting that the insistence on being dead was not merely a symptom of illness but could also represent a deeply internalized philosophical or psychological experience. For those observing, it was simultaneously fascinating and terrifying, a glimpse into a realm where human consciousness and mortality collided in ways that defied comprehension. As the months passed, the presence of these individuals became a defining feature of the asylum. Their claims spread beyond the walls, entering public consciousness through reports, letters, and rumors. The city of Rome, already attuned to the specters of its own history, began to whisper of the walking dead within the institution. The phenomenon captured the imagination of writers, medical practitioners, and the curious alike, creating a legacy that would persist in both folklore and early psychiatric literature. Within the asylum, however, the reality remained immediate and pressing. Living with, observing, and attempting to care for those who insisted they were no longer alive was a daily confrontation with the limits of human understanding, medical authority, and the nature of consciousness itself. In this way, the asylum became more than a facility for treatment. It became a stage upon which the human mind enacted its most profound fears and fascinations. The dead inmates were at once prisoners and teachers, offering a glimpse into a dimension of experience that most would never encounter but could not easily ignore. Their insistence on their own death was not merely a symptom to be cured, but a window into the intersection of history, culture, and the deepest mysteries of human existence. In the shadowed corridors, beneath the flickering lamps and within the echoing walls, the question lingered constantly: what does it truly mean to be alive, and what does it mean to insist, against all evidence, that one is not? The first reports of these extraordinary claims began quietly, almost as though they feared being noticed. Physicians, nurses, and occasional visitors documented small, unsettling incidents that, at first, seemed isolated or coincidental. One nurse, for example, recorded in her diary how a middle-aged man, who had been admitted for melancholia, refused breakfast, insisting that he no longer needed sustenance because his body was already dead. She initially assumed this was simply an expression of depression, a refusal common among the mentally ill, yet she was struck by the precision and calm in his tone. Unlike typical episodes of melancholy, there was no pleading, no despair, only a clear, unwavering declaration of his own non-existence. As reports accumulated, the pattern became undeniable. Inmates would speak of their own deaths in vivid detail, describing sensations that no living person should experience. Some claimed to feel the cold embrace of death in their limbs, the absence of warmth and vitality, as though life had already fled their bodies. Others described observing their own funerals, recounting the faces of mourners, the rituals of burial, and the finality of the coffin closing above them. These accounts were recorded in meticulous detail by asylum staff, who were increasingly both fascinated and disturbed. What unsettled them most was the consistency across different wards, patients, and even varying ages and backgrounds. It was as if these individuals were drawing from a shared understanding of mortality that transcended personal experience, an understanding that should have been impossible for the living to possess. Visitors to the asylum were often the first to give voice to the public reaction. Families who came to see their loved ones were confronted with a reality that challenged both reason and faith. Many described the patients' voices as calm, eerily precise, and void of the fear or confusion one might expect from the mentally ill. A mother who had come to check on her adult son wrote in a letter to a friend that she had never seen such conviction in anyone. He speaks of his own death as though he were recounting the weather, ordinary, certain, and immutable. It chills me to the bone, for I cannot argue, nor do I wish to, against what he insists is true. Such accounts spread beyond private correspondence, reaching physicians in other cities and even newspapers, adding layers of both skepticism and macabre fascination to the growing story. Staff members found themselves in a precarious position. They were expected to maintain order, administer care, and adhere to medical principles, yet the phenomenon continually challenged the very foundation of their authority. When patients declared themselves dead, it was no mere eccentricity. It was a statement that undermined the structure of the asylum itself. Orders were ignored, meals refused, and participation in daily routines became a battleground between life and what the inmates insisted was already absence. Some staff attempted rational interventions, coaxing patients with food, conversation, or distraction, but they often met with unwavering resistance. Even when the physical body responded to stimuli, the consciousness behind it remained detached, observing rather than participating, as if tethered to life only by the thin thread of physical presence. Physicians began to debate the nature of the phenomenon with increasing intensity. Some argued that these behaviors were advanced manifestations of melancholia, catatonia, or hysteria. Others, more daring in their speculation, considered the possibility of a shared delusional state, a psychological contagion of sorts, wherein the certainty of one patient might influence another. Still, a small faction believed there might be something inexplicable, a phenomenon that had yet to be described by contemporary medical science. These debates were not merely theoretical. They influenced treatment protocols, the allocation of staff attention, and the way visitors were allowed to interact with the patients. The asylum became a crucible for the tensions between emerging psychiatry, traditional beliefs, and the deeply ingrained human fascination with death. One of the most chilling aspects of the reports was the detailed awareness of death exhibited by the inmates. They were not merely claiming an abstract or metaphorical death. They described physical and sensory experiences with unnerving precision. Some spoke of the weightlessness that accompanies death, the strange sense of silence within the body, and the perception of life continuing externally while they themselves were absent from it. They could describe what it felt like to be looked upon by the living, yet remain untouchable, untouched, unperceived as truly present. Nurses reported feeling a cold, almost imperceptible distance when interacting with these patients, as if the very essence of the individual had withdrawn into a separate plane. Visitors echoed this sentiment, noting an uncanny detachment in demeanor and gaze. The phenomenon did not remain confined to a single ward or age group. Adolescents, middle-aged adults, and the elderly all exhibited similar behaviors. Some were articulate and composed, others erratic and fragmented in speech, yet the core assertion remained the same: they were no longer alive. Even patients who had initially resisted the notion gradually began to mimic the behaviors, refusing food or speaking of death in similar terms. This raised new questions among the staff. Could these claims be a form of social mimicry, or were they the emergence of a previously unrecognized psychiatric condition? The answer remained elusive, adding to the sense of dread and fascination surrounding the asylum. Letters, diaries, and official reports became vital in documenting the phenomenon. Nurses would record the exact phrasing used by the inmates, sometimes noting the rhythm of speech, gestures, or facial expressions. Physicians compiled these observations into reports that circulated among their peers, seeking validation, confirmation, or explanation. One doctor described a patient stating, with absolute conviction, that my body feeds itself no longer. It is but a hollow shell through which I observe the living, yet touch none of their joys or pains. Such statements challenged the very framework of contemporary medical thought, straddling the line between delusion, existential philosophy, and an almost supernatural assertion of detachment from life. It was not only the words themselves that unsettled staff and visitors, but the way the inmates acted upon them. Some refused to walk, claiming that their bodies no longer belonged to them. Others moved mechanically, as if guided by some invisible force. Sleep became irregular and often unnecessary, as patients asserted that their biological needs were no longer in alignment with the living world. The regular cadence of institutional life, the ringing of bells, the serving of meals, the routine inspections, was disrupted by these individuals who existed simultaneously within and outside the realm of life. Each encounter was a confrontation with mortality made manifest, forcing those around them to grapple with existential questions they had previously only contemplated in theory. By the end of the first year that these behaviors were observed, the phenomenon had taken on a life of its own. Visitors whispered of the walking dead inside the asylum, families debated the nature of the affliction, and physicians continued to document, theorize, and debate. The story began to leak into broader Roman society, where the city's pre-existing fascination with death, ghosts, and spiritual matters made the claims all the more compelling. The asylum had become a focal point for questions that extended far beyond medicine. What does it mean to exist? Can consciousness survive in a body that no longer feels life? And perhaps most haunting of all, what separates the living from the dead if perception, awareness, and belief can dissolve that boundary so completely? In this way, the first reports were not just the beginning of a medical case study, they were the spark that ignited a deeper cultural and psychological exploration. They revealed how fear, fascination, and uncertainty could intersect to create an atmosphere of dread and inquiry. They forced the asylum's inhabitants and staff, as well as the broader public, to confront the fragility of human existence. And in doing so, they set the stage for a story that would continue to reverberate through history, a tale of individuals who claimed to have transcended life, leaving everyone around them to grapple with questions that had no easy answers. Among the asylum's population, certain individuals stood apart, not through violence, nor through obvious eccentricity, but through the intensity and consistency of their claim that they were already dead. These were not fleeting statements, nor acts of rebellion. They were deeply internalized experiences, expressed with a calm and deliberate conviction that unsettled all who encountered them. To understand the phenomenon fully, it is necessary to examine the lives, histories, and behaviors of these inmates, for it was in the details of their personal narratives that the horror and fascination of the story took root. One of the earliest documented cases involved a middle-aged man named Antonio. He had been admitted to the asylum following a series of nervous breakdowns, precipitated by personal loss and financial ruin. Antonio was of modest background, raised in the rural outskirts of Rome, where death had always been a tangible presence. He had witnessed the passing of siblings and neighbors with a frequency that marked him deeply. When he arrived at the asylum, his behavior was outwardly calm, but he soon began to exhibit the peculiar conviction that he was no longer alive. Staff reported that he refused food, claiming that sustenance could no longer nourish him, and spent hours staring at his reflection, insisting that the man in the mirror belonged to someone who had once lived but was now gone. His words were precise, his tone devoid of fear or confusion, and yet the truth of what he claimed was impossible to deny in its intensity. Those who observed him spoke of a man physically present yet spiritually absent, a witness to life from a distance he could no longer cross. Another notable case was that of Isabella, a young woman whose delicate frame and quiet demeanor concealed a mind steeped in trauma and obsession. She had endured repeated illness in childhood, the death of several close relatives, and the social isolation of a young woman living in a patriarchal society with limited opportunity. When Isabella began asserting that she had already died, it was first expressed in whispers, comments about feeling cold in her limbs, the emptiness in her chest, the sensation that she observed the world as an outsider. Over time, these whispers grew into full declarations, delivered with a calm certainty that terrified visitors and staff alike. She would speak of her own funeral in vivid detail, recounting the faces of mourners, the rituals performed, and the sensation of being lowered into the earth. Yet she remained present, conscious, interacting with her environment in other ways. Her dual existence, alive in body, dead in spirit, became one of the most documented and studied examples of the phenomenon. Then there was Marco, a man whose intellect and education set him apart from many of the other inmates. Marco had once been a teacher, a man who lived with an appreciation for logic and reason, yet he too became ensnared in the belief that he had died. What made his case particularly compelling was the way he articulated the philosophy of his death. He spoke not only of the physical sensations of being dead, but of the existential implications, that life around him continued, vibrant and unaware, while he existed in a liminal space, neither fully part of the living nor wholly departed. Staff noted that Marco's reasoning was internally coherent, his speech logical and consistent, yet it defied the most fundamental understanding of biology and consciousness. To witness him was to confront a living paradox, a man who could explain, rationalize, and analyze his own absence with chilling clarity. The behaviors of these individuals shared common elements, creating patterns that were impossible to ignore. Many refused food and drink, claiming that their physical bodies were no longer necessary vessels. Some would refuse to move freely about the asylum, walking mechanically or remaining seated for hours on end, as if tethered to life by the thinnest of threads. They spoke of their own deaths with an intimacy that suggested they had experienced them firsthand, describing not only the physical sensation of ceasing to live but also the psychological and spiritual experience of detachment from the living world. They recounted funerary customs with uncanny precision, and some even predicted aspects of their own deaths or the deaths of others with unsettling accuracy. It is important to note that the consistency of these behaviors was one of the most disturbing aspects for the staff. While delusions and eccentricities were common in the asylum, these inmates displayed a remarkable coherence and repetition. Across wards, ages, and social backgrounds, the narratives converged: refusal of sustenance, detachment from the world of the living, observation of life as an outsider, and meticulous attention to the details of death rituals. These were not random expressions of madness, but rather sustained, systematic experiences that suggested a phenomenon yet to be understood by contemporary medicine. Their interactions with each other were also of interest. In some instances, the dead inmates would recognize and validate one another's experiences, speaking as though in agreement about the nature of their existence. In other cases, they seemed entirely unaware of each other's beliefs, yet the similarity of behaviors and statements suggested that the phenomenon was not limited to a single individual or case. It was, instead, a cluster of experiences that challenged the conventional understanding of life, death, and consciousness. Family histories provide further insight into the emergence of these beliefs. Many of the inmates who claimed to be dead had experienced trauma that shaped their preoccupation with mortality. Repeated exposure to illness and death, social isolation, and intense personal loss created a psychological environment in which the boundary between life and death could be perceived as fragile. Some had been raised in devoutly religious households, steeped in ritual and doctrine that emphasized the soul's existence beyond the physical body. This combination of psychological vulnerability and cultural conditioning may have contributed to the intensity of their convictions, though it could not fully explain the coherence and precision with which they articulated their experiences. Observers were often struck by the duality of these individuals. Physically, they were present, moving through the halls, responding to commands, and engaging with the world in measurable ways. Spiritually, emotionally, and cognitively, they claimed absence. This separation of body and mind, this persistent detachment, created a tension that was difficult for witnesses to reconcile. Nurses reported a sense of unease, as though they were interacting with entities that existed partially in the world of the living and partially in an invisible realm. Visitors described similar experiences, noting the hollow, distant gaze, the deliberate speech, and the calm assertion of non-existence. In each case, the individuals embodied a living paradox, a collision of human biology and subjective reality that challenged every assumption about what it means to be alive. What is particularly compelling is that not all of the dead inmates exhibited classic symptoms of mental illness. Some were articulate, composed, and capable of rational thought even as they insisted on their own death. Others produced creative works, letters, poems, and sketches that explored the concept of absence, detachment, and mortality with sophistication and depth. These expressions suggested that the insistence on being dead was not merely a symptom of disease but also a deeply internalized psychological or existential experience. To witness these individuals was to confront a profound human mystery, the capacity of the mind to inhabit, fully and consciously, a state that defies physical reality. Through these profiles, a picture emerges of the asylum as both a site of confinement and a stage upon which some of the most profound questions of human existence were enacted. Each inmate, with their unique history, behavior, and conviction, contributed to a broader phenomenon that challenged medicine, philosophy, and culture alike. Their lives were a testament to the fragile boundaries between consciousness and reality, between life and death, and between human understanding and the mysteries that lie beyond. To walk through the asylum and observe them was to step into a world where certainty and uncertainty, life and death, coexisted in a haunting, inescapable tension, leaving all who witnessed it with a sense of awe, fear, and profound unease. The phenomenon of inmates claiming they were dead posed a challenge not only to social and familial norms but to the very foundations of contemporary medicine. The physicians at the asylum were trained to observe, categorize, and treat the human mind according to the best knowledge of their time. Yet here, in 1886 Rome, they were confronted with behaviors that defied conventional understanding. In many ways, the situation illuminated the limitations of medical science in an era when psychiatry was still in its infancy, and the mind remained a largely uncharted territory. The claims of the dead inmates demanded a confrontation with theories that ranged from the plausible to the almost fantastical, straddling the line between rational explanation and existential horror. The earliest explanations offered by asylum staff leaned heavily on the familiar diagnoses of the day. Melancholia was frequently invoked, a condition marked by extreme sadness, withdrawal, and preoccupation with death. Physicians observed that many of the inmates exhibited behaviors associated with this condition: refusal to eat, prolonged periods of immobility, and persistent verbalizations about death. Yet melancholia alone could not account for the coherence, precision, and repetition in the claims. Unlike ordinary depressive patients, these individuals spoke of death as a lived experience, describing sensory and psychological phenomena that suggested a state beyond ordinary comprehension. Physicians noted that their observations required an expansion of existing medical frameworks, yet no suitable category existed. Some doctors proposed catatonia as a potential explanation. This condition, characterized by physical immobility, rigidity, or repetitive movements, offered a partial framework for understanding the mechanical behaviors observed in certain inmates. Patients would remain seated for hours, refuse to interact, or move with deliberate, slow precision, as if their bodies were puppets detached from the will of life. Catatonia could account for the physical manifestations, but it failed to explain the articulate verbalizations and existential assertions of death. The combination of cognitive clarity and physical withdrawal created a paradox that even the most experienced psychiatrists struggled to reconcile. Hysteria, another commonly cited condition, was suggested as an explanation for the behaviors of some female inmates. In the 19th century, hysteria was a catch-all diagnosis often applied to women exhibiting unusual psychological or physical symptoms. It was thought to arise from emotional trauma or imbalance, and treatments ranged from the benign to the invasive. Some physicians considered that the insistence on being dead might represent an extreme form of hysteria, a psychological defense against suffering or trauma. Yet again, the depth and consistency of the claims did not fit neatly into this explanation. Hysteria could account for emotional displays or somatic symptoms, but it could not fully explain the philosophical and existential coherence of the inmates' insistence on their own death. As the cases multiplied, physicians began to consider the possibility of a shared delusional state, a concept that would later be referred to as folia do or, in broader clusters, folia plusieurs. Could these individuals be influencing one another, feeding a shared perception of death that spread like a psychological contagion? While some inmates did seem to validate one another's experiences, the phenomenon appeared across diverse wards, age groups, and social backgrounds, suggesting that the delusion was not merely socially transmitted. The notion of a contagion of thought was tantalizing but ultimately incomplete. It could not explain why the intensity and precision of these delusions mirrored one another with uncanny similarity. Neurological theories were in their infancy, yet some doctors speculated about possible organic causes. Could disruptions in circulation, brain function, or sensory perception create the illusion of death while life continued? Certain inmates described numbness, coldness, or a sense of detachment from their own bodies, symptoms that seemed to parallel emerging understandings of brain pathology and peripheral nerve dysfunction. Yet the physiological evidence was limited, and no clear pathology could be identified. The patients were physically alive, their vital signs normal, and their cognitive faculties largely intact. The absence of a medical explanation only deepened the sense of mystery and, for some, reinforced the chilling nature of their claims. Philosophical speculation also entered medical discourse. The late 19th century was a period of intellectual ferment, in which science and philosophy often intersected. Some physicians pondered whether the phenomenon might reflect an extraordinary psychological insight into the nature of consciousness and mortality. Were these inmates experiencing a dissociation so profound that they perceived themselves as no longer alive? Was it possible that their minds had, through trauma, illness, or existential reflection, arrived at a state of awareness that transcended ordinary human experience? While speculative, such ideas were treated with a mixture of curiosity and caution, for they skirted dangerously close to the metaphysical, challenging the boundaries of empirical observation and medical authority. The doctors were careful to document every detail, aware that these cases were exceptional. They noted the precise words used by the inmates, their postures, interactions, and the apparent logic of their statements. Some physicians corresponded with colleagues in other Italian cities, seeking confirmation of similar cases and attempting to build a body of knowledge that might eventually yield understanding. Others wrote reports that were more philosophical than clinical, attempting to grapple with the existential implications of patients who existed simultaneously in life and death. These reports were circulated in medical journals and shared privately among psychiatrists, creating a dialogue that blended clinical observation with philosophical inquiry. Treatment, when attempted, was as experimental as the understanding of the phenomena itself. Physicians would encourage patients to eat, participate in daily routines, or engage in conversation, yet these interventions were often met with polite but firm refusal. Some patients accepted limited interaction but maintained their assertions of death. Others became agitated when confronted with reminders of the living world. There was no standard therapy for those insisting they were dead, no protocol to restore their connection to life. In some cases, doctors resorted to sedation or mechanical restraint, not as punishment, but as a way to manage physical risk and maintain order within the institution. Yet even in these instances, the existential claims persisted, unshaken by external intervention. In retrospect, these cases are now recognized as among the earliest documented instances of what would later be called Coded's delusion, a psychiatric phenomenon in which individuals believe they are dead, do not exist, or have lost their internal organs or blood. At the time, however, there was no terminology, no framework to describe the experience. The physician's attempts to reconcile observation with theory reveal both the limitations of 19th century medicine and the extraordinary nature of the phenomenon. It was, in many ways, a collision between emerging psychiatric science and the darker, ineffable aspects of human consciousness, an encounter that forced physicians to confront not only the mind's fragility but the mystery of existence itself. Ultimately, the medical theories and misdiagnoses surrounding these cases reflect the tension between the known and the unknown, between empirical observation and the incomprehensible complexity of the human mind. The physician's meticulous documentation, careful theorizing, and occasional philosophical reflection laid the groundwork for future understanding, yet the chilling intensity of the inmates' experiences remained, in many ways, beyond explanation. For those living and working within the asylum, the claim of being dead was not a curiosity, it was a daily confrontation with the limits of medicine, the fragility of life, and the terrifying possibility that consciousness can inhabit a state entirely divorced from the living world. As the cases of the dead inmates were observed and documented, some physicians began to notice patterns that transcended the boundaries of ordinary mental illness. These individuals were not merely melancholic or catatonic. Their insistence on being dead shared remarkable similarities with what modern psychiatry would eventually classify as Coded's delusion, a rare and profoundly unsettling condition in which a person believes they are dead, missing vital organs, or otherwise non-existent. At the time, of course, there was no terminology to describe such a phenomenon. Physicians and staff were confronted with behaviors and statements that resisted categorization, leaving them to grapple with the terrifying possibility that their patients were experiencing a condition entirely unknown to medical science. The connection between the Roman cases and the later recognition of Coded's delusion is both striking and eerie. Patients displayed an acute dissociation from their physical bodies, describing the absence of life not metaphorically but as a tangible reality. Some spoke of bodily sensations as though they were already beyond mortality, the lack of warmth, the failure of the heart to beat, or the perception that blood no longer circulated through their veins. Others described existing in a shadowed realm, able to observe the living world but unable to participate in it. These experiences mirrored the modern clinical descriptions of coded's patients, who report a profound detachment from reality and a belief in their own death or non-existence. It is notable that these experiences were not limited to a single individual or isolated episode. Across the wards of the asylum, multiple inmates displayed remarkably similar behaviors and narratives, despite differences in age, social status, and medical history. This suggested that the phenomenon was not purely idiosyncratic but might point to a deeper, possibly neurological or psychological mechanism. The consistency of the delusion across different patients challenged contemporary medical thought and forced physicians to consider the limitations of their understanding. How could the mind generate such detailed, coherent experiences of death while the body remained fully alive? What mechanisms within the brain or psyche could produce this vivid dissociation from life? The intellectual implications of these cases were profound. Physicians began to consider not only the observable behaviors but the philosophical dimensions of the experience. If a person can exist fully conscious yet perceive themselves as dead, what does that say about the nature of life, consciousness, and identity? The asylum became a space in which medical science, existential reflection, and human horror intersected. Each patient who claimed to be dead served as a living example of the fragile boundary between being and non-being, challenging both the staff's scientific assumptions and their understanding of reality itself. Some physicians noted that these delusions often emerged in patients with histories of trauma, grief, or extreme isolation. In this sense, the phenomenon was not only neurological but deeply psychological. The human mind, when subjected to repeated suffering or existential pressure, appeared capable of constructing an entirely new framework of reality, one in which the patient could assert with complete conviction that they no longer belonged to the living world. Yet what made the Roman cases particularly compelling was the level of detail and coherence in the narratives. Unlike simple hallucinations or erratic delusions, the patient's accounts were structured, internally consistent, and delivered with an eerie calm. Observers also recorded how these delusions could influence the atmosphere of the asylum itself. Staff and fellow inmates were unsettled, some reporting a sense of unease or dread in the presence of those who claimed to be dead. The phenomenon became almost performative in its intensity, not intentionally theatrical, but imbued with a power that transcended the individual. The delusion acted as a lens, focusing the anxieties, fears, and unspoken questions about life and death that pervaded both the institution and the city beyond its walls. Rome, already steeped in religious ritual and cultural fascination with mortality, provided fertile ground for such a phenomenon to resonate deeply with those who witnessed it. By framing these cases through the lens of what would later be recognized as coded's delusion, it becomes possible to understand the Roman inmates as part of a broader, timeless exploration of human consciousness and mortality. These individuals, through no fault of their own, occupied a psychological space that defied ordinary experience. They were living yet claimed absence, conscious yet affirmed non-existence, and in doing so forced all who observed them to confront unsettling questions. What truly separates life from death? How much of our identity depends on our perception of being alive? And to what extent can the human mind create realities that exist entirely outside shared experience? In retrospect, the asylum of 1886 can be seen as a crucible in which the earliest documented cases of coded-like delusions took form. The behaviors of the inmates, the meticulous observation by physicians, and the broader cultural context of Rome combined to produce one of the most haunting intersections of psychiatry, philosophy, and human experience. The delusions were not mere symptoms of illness. They were windows into the terrifying possibilities of consciousness, a reminder that the line between the living and the dead is far more delicate than society, or even medicine, might assume. Beyond the clinical observations and medical records, much of the unsettling legacy of the asylum in 1886 comes from the accounts of those who witnessed the dead inmates firsthand. Letters, diaries, and whispered rumors provide a haunting perspective, revealing how these individuals were perceived not only by physicians but by the families, friends, and casual visitors who ventured into the institution. The reactions of these outsiders often blended fear, fascination, and disbelief, offering a glimpse into how such phenomena resonated beyond the asylum's walls and into the cultural consciousness of Rome. Visitors consistently remarked on the eerie composure of the patients. In diaries and letters, they described a stillness that was unlike ordinary lethargy or sadness, a calm detachment that suggested the person existed simultaneously in the world of the living and the world beyond. One visitor, a distant cousin of an inmate, recounted in a letter that the patient speaks of death as if it were the most mundane matter, yet there is in his eyes a depth I cannot penetrate, a quiet knowledge that chills the heart. Others reported that the inmates would fix their gaze upon the living, acknowledging their presence without truly engaging with them, as though perceiving the world through a transparent veil that separated their existence from reality. This liminal quality created an unsettling atmosphere, leaving visitors with the sense that they had encountered something beyond human comprehension. The letters also reveal a pattern of careful documentation by families. Some wrote down exact phrases spoken by the inmates, noting the rhythm, tone, and cadence of their voices. These observations were remarkably consistent. Patients insisted on their own death, described sensations of coldness or emptiness, and detailed experiences of observing life from the outside. Families expressed a mixture of grief, anxiety, and awe, often questioning whether the behavior was the result of illness, psychological trauma, or something more inexplicable. In one letter, a mother described her son's insistence that he had died months prior, recounting his meticulous description of his own funeral and the faces of mourners who had come to pay their respects. She wrote that she could not argue against what he claimed, nor did she wish to, for the conviction in his voice seemed absolute. Rumors spread quickly through the city as these accounts circulated. Local communities, already steeped in superstition and an intimate familiarity with death, found the stories both terrifying and compelling. Some whispered that the asylum had become a place where the living and the dead coexisted, where spirits lingered in corporeal form, and where the boundaries of mortality were being tested. Visitors to the city reported hearing about the walking dead within the institution, a phrase that carried both horror and fascination. These rumors contributed to a growing mystique around the asylum, amplifying its reputation as a place of uncanny phenomena and moral as well as medical uncertainty. The diaries of staff members add yet another layer to the narrative. Nurses and attendants recorded not only what the patients said but how their presence affected the environment. Many described a sense of unease, a feeling that the inmates' detachment created a palpable tension within the halls. Some reported that ordinary tasks, feeding, cleaning, guiding patients, took on a ritualistic quality when performed in the presence of someone insisting they were dead. The staff often found themselves questioning their own perceptions, unsure whether they were witnessing delusion, extraordinary insight, or a reality that existed outside conventional understanding. These internal reflections, recorded in journals and official reports, reveal the profound psychological impact the phenomenon had on those tasked with caring for the inmates. Occasionally, visitors provided accounts of interaction that seemed almost supernatural. One letter described a patient speaking of his own death in the past tense, only to pause mid-conversation as though sensing the presence of another unseen entity. The visitor wrote of feeling an invisible weight, a coldness that seemed to emanate from the inmate, and a certainty that the person before them was simultaneously alive and absent. Such experiences, while anecdotal, highlight the uncanny quality of these interactions and underscore the difficulty in separating observation from perception, fact from the deeply unsettling impression that reality itself had shifted. The convergence of these witness accounts paints a picture not only of individual delusion but of a broader phenomenon that affected all who encountered it. Families, staff, and casual visitors alike were drawn into the inmate's assertion of death, whether through fear, empathy, or sheer fascination. The stories circulated beyond the asylum, entering the cultural imagination of Rome, a city long familiar with the proximity of mortality in daily life. In this way, the voices of witnesses, through letters, diaries, and rumors, become crucial to understanding the historical and psychological impact of the events. They show how the phenomenon extended beyond clinical observation into the lived experience of those who encountered it, and how the fear of the walking dead became a shared, tangible part of the city's dark lore. Ultimately, these accounts illuminate the human response to the inexplicable. The dead inmates were not only medical curiosities but catalysts for existential reflection, forcing everyone who observed them to grapple with questions about life, death, and the boundaries of consciousness. The documentation left by witnesses provides a haunting testament to the phenomenon's intensity and persistence, capturing the fear, fascination, and deep unease that surrounded these individuals. Their presence left an indelible mark not only on the asylum but on the cultural and historical memory of Rome itself, cementing their place in a story that continues to unsettle and intrigue more than a century later. The aftermath of the events within the asylum was as complex and unsettling as the phenomena themselves. Word of the inmates who claimed they were already dead spread slowly at first, primarily through medical reports and private correspondence, but it eventually reached the broader public consciousness. Families and visitors who had encountered the inmates shared their experiences, blending fact, fear, and rumor into narratives that traveled beyond the asylum walls. The city of Rome, already steeped in religious symbolism, superstition, and reverence for death, absorbed these stories with a mixture of fascination and dread. For many, the idea that someone could be alive yet insist on their own death was not merely a psychiatric anomaly. It was a confrontation with the very essence of mortality, a challenge to deeply held beliefs about life, the soul, and the afterlife. The public reaction was multifaceted. Some viewed the events with horror, fearful of contagion, not of disease, but of madness, of a psychological state that could erode the boundary between the living and the dead. Others were captivated, seeing in these cases an almost mythic resonance with the city's ancient ruins, tombs, and funerary rituals. Rome itself, with its cemeteries, catacombs, and centuries-old traditions surrounding death, seemed to provide fertile soil for such stories to take root in collective imagination. Rumors circulated in cafes and piazzas, blending anecdote with speculation, each retelling heightening the sense of unease and mystery. Within the medical and psychiatric community, the asylum's reports prompted intense debate. Physicians struggled to reconcile these behaviors with the limited psychiatric knowledge of the time. Some argued that the claims of death were extreme manifestations of melancholia, hysteria, or catatonia, while others suggested a more radical explanation, that the patients had tapped into a dimension of consciousness inaccessible to ordinary perception. The debates were not merely theoretical. They influenced treatment protocols, allocation of resources, and the way the asylum managed both patients and visitors. Doctors were forced to walk a delicate line between maintaining authority, providing care, and acknowledging the disturbing possibility that some experiences could not be fully understood or controlled. The events also triggered reflection on institutional practices. The asylum's administration, recognizing the growing public attention and the distress these cases caused among staff and families, began to implement stricter supervision and documentation procedures. Patients' interactions with visitors were carefully managed, and staff received instructions on how to respond to persistent declarations of death without escalating panic or distress. These measures were intended to maintain order, but they also highlighted the limitations of medical authority when faced with experiences that defied conventional understanding. In many ways, the phenomenon forced the institution to confront its own inadequacies, revealing that no amount of supervision or structure could entirely contain the psychological realities of the human mind. The broader cultural impact was equally significant. Stories of the walking dead within the asylum began to influence literature, folklore, and even early psychiatric discourse. Writers, poets, and intellectuals were drawn to the eerie tension between life and death, using the asylum's events as inspiration for tales of ghosts, liminality, and existential horror. These narratives, while often dramatized, help solidify the phenomenon in the public imagination, transforming the isolated experiences of a few individuals into a symbol of humanity's fragile grasp on mortality and consciousness. Ultimately, the aftermath of the asylum cases illustrates the profound ripple effect of events that challenge fundamental assumptions about life and death. The reactions of the public, medical professionals, and cultural observers reveal a society grappling with the unknown, negotiating the boundaries between science, superstition, and the terrifying possibilities of the human mind. The story of these inmates was no longer confined to the asylum. It had entered the fabric of Rome itself, leaving an enduring mark on both history and imagination, a haunting reminder that the line between the living and the dead is sometimes far thinner than anyone dares to imagine.